Okay, brothers, good morning. Good morning. Last class, we spoke about Sappho and her legacy as a great lyrical poet. Who can remind me something about Sappho's legacy? What is what she handed over to posterity, and what is what the history of thought and the history of literature receives from Sappho?
The Sapphic stanza, like the three.
The Sapphic stanza, like a metrical pattern. And in general, how is that called? Isosyllabism. Isosyllabism. Isos in Greek meaning the same. Syllabon. Okay, so a beat meaning a syllable. So it has always the same number of syllables. Very good, very good. I'm going to explain something about this, because here we have some Sapphic stanzas, right, that we studied. El themoi kainun halepan delison ek merimnan hossa demoi telesa ithimo sime reiteleson sidauta simachos eso. This is 11, 11, 11, 5. This is a Sapphic stanza, and we always follow the same pattern in Sapphic stanzas. 11, 11, 11, 5. Something that we didn't have in epic poems, because in epic poems we had beats, right? So we had a beat, and we had 6 beats, which is a dactylic hexameter, but the number of syllables don't necessarily match, because a long syllable can substitute 2 short ones, right? Okay, I just want to highlight a small thing before we continue about the metrical patterns. You can call it some kind of transition between the epic poems and the metrical patterns that we are going to find in lyric poetry. Elegiac distic. I repeat, elegiac distic. In Spanish, it is dístico elegíaco. And that is properly the metrical pattern of lyrical poetry. Elegiac distic. Why is it a distic? Because it comes with 2 verses, and it is proper of the elegiac poems. And this is going to be something remarkable that eventually we are going to see, especially in Latin poetry. In Roman poets, we are going to encounter this again. But I just want you to observe how this metrical pattern is formed. O anale tu suye dios te kosupo te seyo. What is that? A normal hexameter. So you could very well find this in Homer, right? It's 6. O anale tu suye dios te kosupo te seyo. 6. O Lord, son of Leto and child of Zeus, upoteseio lesso mayarchomenos utapopaumenos. And here something changes. I will never forget you, neither in the beginning nor in the end. What does this mean? What has changed here? Lesso mayarchomenos utapopaumenos. So we shorten it. It's 6, and the second one is 5, with a split in the middle. So it's actually 2.5 plus 2.5, total 5. Lesso mayarchomenos, lesso mayarchome half, 2.5, udapopaume nos, 2.5, total of 5. And this is what we are going to follow forever. And this is the proper metrical pattern of the elegiac distic that we are going to use in lyrical poetry. 6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 5. I will never forget you, neither in the beginning nor at the end. Al ae proton te kahistaton kai ente mesoisin ae sosi demoi clifi kai est fladidu. I will never forget you in the beginning. I will never forget you at the end. I will never forget you in the middle. I will always sing to you. Syde moi kluthi. And as a prayer, he's asking him to listen to me, kai esthla didu, and give me blessings. Phoebe anax. And who's that? Child of Letos, and who's the child of Zeus? It's the same person. Apollos, or Phoebe in Greek, Phoebos. Oh, Phoebe anax. Oh, Lord Apollo. Hotemen setheate kepotni aleto, when the great Leto begat you, Phoinikos radies hersin ephepsamene, holding in her hand Phoenician palm, Athanaton Calliston, and she begat you. What is Calliston? The superlative of Kalos, being the most beautiful among Athanaton, among the immortal gods. Athanaton Calliston epitrochoe delimne, around a circular fountain or a circular pond. Pásamene pleste de los apeires yes. Pásamene pleste, 2.5, de los apeires ye. Odmes ambrosies gelasse de Gaia pelore. So the whole earth was, the whole island of Delos was filled with the smell of ambrosia. Gelasse de Gaia pelore. Gaia is another form of saying ge. And the wide, the spacious earth smiled. Gethese de Bathis pontos a los polies. And the ocean rejoiced. The ocean of Alos Polies, of gray salt, rejoiced. This is an elegiac distich written by Theognis de Megara. And even if you don't have it in the anthology, Theognis of Megara, I just want you to keep that in your minds, because eventually we're going to come to see how this elegiac distich becomes so important and so relevant, especially in Latin poetry. Okay, good. Today we're going to continue speaking about Alcaeus and Anacreon. And maybe we'll have some time to speak about Archelaus of Paros, but if we don't have enough time to speak about him, I think we're okay. Sappho handed over to posterity the Sapphic stanza and also the ideals of beauty and love. So that is what I have termed as a Sapphic Revolution. It is the love she expresses, and of course there's also this open question, and it's a question that remains open, of what kind of love this love is. Is it some kind of physical affection, or is it just merely poetically and idealized love? That's an open question, and I also mentioned that most of her work was lost. Now, Alcaeus, sometimes, and I'm taking this from the Encyclopedia Britannica, you can also find Alcaeus pronounced as Alcaios. Alcaios is a more Greek pronunciation, instead Alcaeus is a more English pronunciation. Alcaeus was a contemporary of Sappho, and they exchanged poems, and they mentioned one another in their poems, and they both excel in monody. Monody meaning they chanted their poems alone, monos, unaccompanied, as opposed to those other poets who composed for a professional chorus to perform. So they recited or chanted their poems in a personal way with a small circle of friends. And it looks like Sappho and Alcaeus were friends. And they exchanged poems and they mentioned one another. Alcaeus, we don't have a precise date of his birth, but he must have been born sometime around 625 BC. And he died sometime around 580 BC. He was also born in the island of Lesbos. in Mytilene, and he was born to powerful family. His family was an aristocratic family, and they also had a strong influence in the government. And eventually he himself got involved in politics, especially against the tyrant Myrsilus, and with the aid of the tyrant, the aid of his brother himself and a friend who turned out to be not so friendly, he betrayed him, whose name was Pyrrhus. The three of them plotted against the tyrant Myrsilus, but Pyrrhus betrayed him and gave away the conspiracy. So he and his brother ended up leaving the island of Lesbos and wandering in exile. And unlike Sappho, who came back to the island of Lesbos, I think around the year 591. Alcæus never returned to Lesbos, which doesn't mean that he was miserable, because he spent a lot of time traveling. He even went to Egypt. He took part in a battle in Athens, and the Athenians took the upper hand, so he fled. And is this something that catches your attention? He fled, and not only did he flee, but he composed a poem about his shield that he had abandoned, that he had thrown away, and he had run away. Why is this remarkable? Why should this strike us?
I think that it's completely against the ideal that we have.
It's completely against the ideals that Homer had portrayed. In Homer, we had the ideal of bravery, we had the ideal of courage, we even had the ideal of encountering a glorious death in the battlefield. Instead, Alcæus doesn't seem to feel any shame. On the contrary, he mocks it, and he makes fun of that incident, and he doesn't feel any qualms in handing it over to posterity through a poem. This happened around the year 600. He also wrote in Aeolic dialect, just like Sappho, and for that same reason, a significant part of his work has been lost to us. He wrote something around 10 books, but what we have now is only fragments. Now, a question. We have a contemporary of Sappho of Lesbos, right? We have a contemporary of hers. We know that they encountered one another. We know that they exchanged poems, right? We know that they both are poets that excel in lyrical poetry. We know that their situation and their circumstances were very similar. They both belonged to aristocratic families. They both suffered from a tyrant, and so the question is, what do you think, or what could we expect about the poetry of Alcæus? It would be very similar. No, actually, it's completely the opposite. Whereas in Sappho, we find a lot of idealized feelings, and mostly love, affection. And if we find some gloomy feelings in Sappho, those are the gloomy feelings of unrequited love and of melancholy. In Alcæus, we find a very, very different approach. Definitely he speaks about feelings, but his feelings are mostly feelings of hatred against the tyrant Myrsilus, but then he rejoices when the tyrant Myrsilus dies, and he expresses that joy also in his poems. But he's expressing a feeling about the death of someone, and he also writes very angry poems against his friend who betrayed him, Pyrrhus. So we find a lot of hatred in his poetry. We also find a wider range of themes. For example, he's dealing with everyday affairs, and most scholars consider him not as polished, not as refined, not as pure and natural as Sappho, but a lot more down to earth. Coming back to metrical patterns, I have explained what is a dactylic hexameter. Then as a derivation of that, I have explained what is an elegiac distich that comes with 6, 5, 6, 5, 6, 5. So it's very similar to that. Then we evolve completely into isosyllabism, and that isosyllabism that we find in Sappho gives us the Sapphic stanza, which is 11, 11, 11, 5. And with Alcaios, we find what is called the archaic stanza. The archaic stanza, which is going to be 11, 11, 9, 10. Asinite mitona nemonstasin, tomerganenthen kymakilin to denthen name son tomeson, nai foreme thasym melaina. 11, 11, 9, 10. I could continue reading, but trust me, the second verse is also 11, 11, 9, 10. That is what he handed over to posterity. And it was eventually taken over in Latin poetry, especially by Horace. He veu fugaces postume postume, labunturani nec pietas mora, rugisse instantisse necte, afferet indomiteque morti. It's completely different. The argument is completely different, but the pattern, the metrical pattern that we are using is the same. And I highlighted precisely this archaic stanza, not only because it helps me to show the pattern of 11, 11, 9, 10, but also because of its content, because that's a content that is going to be revived in the future. Asinitemi. Asinitemi is the Greek word. You already know syniemi, to understand. Asinitemi meaning I don't understand. I don't understand. Stasin. What is stasis? The state. You know the word histemi, whose stem is sta. So I do not understand the circumstance. I do not understand the state. I do not understand the situation of what? Ton anemon, of the winds. I don't understand the situation of the winds. This is a poem that reflects about a storm, and he is in a ship. Asinitemi ton anemon stasin. Tomengar enthen kyma kilin detai. Wave is rolling from Enthen, from this side. Kyma is a wave. Kilinteta is rolling. Todenthen. And also from this other side. So we are surrounded by the billows. We are surrounded by the waves. Hames is the Aeolic word for hemes. And we, on Tomeson, we are in the middle. And nai foremetha symelaina. Foremetha, ferein, to take. We are taken, we are carried in the black vessel, in the black ship. Heimoni mochthentes megaloi mala. We are struggling. Mochthentes is struggling against a strong winter or against a strong storm. Heimon can mean either winter or storm. Per mengar antlos istopedan echei, so the mast is falling apart, it's breaking. Laifos de pan tsadelon ede, and the sail has many holes. Actually, laifos, the sail has turned into a rag. Kailakides megalai katauto, and there are large holes all over it. Let me give you a more poetical translation. Now there the wild waves sweep, whilst we betwixt them o'er the deep, in shattered tempest beaten, with labouring ropes are onward driven. The billows dashing o'er our upheaved deck in tatters riven, our sails, whose yawning rents between the raging sea and sky are seen. This is gonna this same pattern and this same theme which, was he speaking about sailing? No, he was speaking about politics. Of course, through the metaphor of a ship. But for him, the situation, the political situation of the island was so tormentuous that he expresses this as a storm. And eventually, Horace will also complain about the political situation with a verse that very much resembles this. And centuries later, Lope de Vega would also retake this very same poem and write a poem about the Spanish nation, the Spanish Empire, that was suffering from its political situation, and he compares that with the state of not a ship but a boat being carried in the waves. That is why I wanted to highlight this poem. Okay, I think I've spoken sufficiently about Alcæus. Are there any questions before we move on to our next author? Okay, good. No questions. Anacreon of Theos. He was born sometime around 582 and died sometime around 485. Yes, Anacreon of Theos was born in 582 and died around 485. And now I ask him, I know that Dr. Kearns gave you a timeline where you see some of the major characters and the major philosophers and the major poets and the major thinkers and where they fall in their in the timeline. I asked you to find the overlap. I think that you even have mention of some of the lyrical poets in that timeline that Dr. Kearns gave you. And I also asked you to find the overlap with what you are learning in history. What was happening in that region in those times?
That one, Persia?
Exactly, the Persian invasion. So if you look at the map, Ionia is very, very far east. It's very far east. So the Persian invasion started there. And as a consequence, Theos, the city of Anacreon, that falls, that is located in the Ionian coast, was invaded, and he had to flee to Thrace. Then, as the Persians kept their advance and kept going on, and this was already during his mature age, so this was around 545. He had to continue moving further to the west, and he founded a colony in Abdera. Eventually, we would have also a great philosopher coming from Abdera, who was Democritus. But now Democritus doesn't play a part in this. I'm just mentioning Democritus because he also came from this very location. So you find some connections. So as the Persians kept their advance, he had to move farther west, and he tried to defend his fatherland and took arms and went to battle, but really he didn't excel, just like Alcæus. And we can see that definitely at this point there's a shift in the value, in the set of values and in the mindset that we have. And bravery and heroism are not regarded as the main value as it was portrayed in the Iliad and to some extent also in the Odyssey. we find that we find a different set of values. And let me just say it now. What is the main value for Anacreon? Wine. Which doesn't mean debauchery, because he condemns that, and he says that that pertains only to Scythians and to barbarians, but nonetheless he exalts the joy of wine, and most of his poetry deals precisely with the joy of wine and of parties and of festivals. So that's the main theme. And again, you can see how we are dealing with feelings, and this is something that goes very much with the flow of lyrical poetry, because we've seen that lyrical poets explore a wide range of feelings and how they all have in common that they speak about feelings, even if these feelings can vary. Because that's human existence, and we can see also how our feelings can vary, and we can find a poet to relate to in different moments of our lives. Then he traveled to Samos, where he became the tutor of the tyrant Polycrates, and he was well received, he was well regarded, he received a lot of honor until the death of the tyrant. But he was so renowned that after the death of the tyrant, Hipparchus, the tyrant of Athens, summoned him and sent an embassy to fetch the renowned poet, and he came to Athens, and he stayed there as a very popular poet and very renowned and very respected until the death or the assassination of Hipparchus, when he returns to his homeland, Teos, where he died and where he was buried. Unlike Sappho and unlike Alcestis, we find a different dialect that was a lot more common and easy to read. So there's a lot more access to Anacreon, and that is the Ionic dialect. Certainly you do find some archaisms in his speech, but nonetheless it's Ionic dialect, which is a lot closer to Homer, and it's a lot closer to a dialect that was not as obscure as the Aeolic dialect. So that gave Anacreon a wider readership, and besides his poetry about wine, he also dedicates some poems to love, to disappointment, to everyday affairs, and so on. Okay, so I think you do have some poems of Anacreon in the anthology, and you can see how he goes through a wide range of situations and how he expresses his feelings before these situations. Any questions about Anacreon? Okay, so even if you don't have it in the anthology, I think it's worth mentioning. I have already mentioned the Theognis of Megara, and there are many other names. For example, Bacchylides and Pindar. They are also great lyrical poets that we have to skip for our course to be able to fit as much as we need. But the influence of lyrical poetry is undeniable. And let me just insert here a parenthesis before I start speaking about Archilakos of Paros. Yes, you have a question? Yes.
What meter of syllables used Anacreon to write this poem?
Iambic. Mostly iambic, and the iambic poetry is not a pattern, but it's just a beat, as opposed to the dactylic poems where you have one long and two short, or two long ones. Okay, Andra moyenne pemusa polytropon hosmola pola. What you have in an iambic poem is just a beat of a short and a long one. It's as simple as that: a short and a long one. Okay, and of course you can find iambic poems that fall with 4 beats, some others that fall with 6, some others that have 3 beats, but the important thing here is that you have 3 beats of a short and a long one, a short and a long one, a short and a long one. And actually, this thing that you're asking about, the metrical pattern that Anacreon uses, brings me back to what I was gonna say. Dotemoi liren homeru, phonies aneute cordes, dotemoi kipela thesmon, dotemoi nomus kerasas. Okay, so we have 3 beats. Long, short, long, short, long, short. And hege melaina pinei. Hege melaina pinei. Pinei thalatha naurus. Timoi majeste tairoi kamoi thelonti pinein. So we have 3. That's a common pattern that we find in... actually, these poems are not original of Anacreon, but they were inspired after Anacreon's poetry, and they're also written in Ionic dialect, and the themes are very much the same. So these poems are called the anacryontica. Okay, but eventually we would find that iambic poetry evolves into iambic hexameter. So instead of having 3 beats, we're going to have 6. And that is what is going to be mostly that is the most representative thing that we're going to find in Greek tragedy. We're going to find iambic hexameters. O koinonau tadel phonis menes kara, 6. Arois hotit seusto napoi dipuka kon, 6. Optek nakat mutu palait niatrophe. And the first 2 verses are the first 2 verses of Antigone. Now I'm bringing up some verses of Oedipus the King. Optek nakat mutu palait niatrophe. Tinas potere drastais demoi thoatsete. Right? So we have 6. That's an iambic hexameter that we find in Greek tragedy. This also sets a pattern that might be artificial, might have some kind of schematism, but I think it's very helpful for us to understand, and it's been studied by some scholars. Let's imagine the whole span of Greek poetry as the life of a person, as the life of a single man, as the life of an individual. So there's a very sense of self during childhood. Nevertheless, we have a very strong and a very vivid imagination that will correspond necessarily to epic poetry, like the poetry we find in Homer and the poetry we find in Hesiod. So according to these scholars, the period of epic poetry would correspond with the infancy or the childhood of Greek literature. Do you get this? Now, what's proper of the teenage years? Feelings. So there's this awakening of feelings. There's this awakening of feelings. And that is what is revived, and that is what is expressed, and that is what is most valued during the lyrical poetry. And today we're finishing lyrical poetry, and then we're going to continue with tragedy. What is proper about Greek tragedy? Maturity and reflection. Yes, reflection about destiny, reflection about life, reflection about destiny, reflection about, what did you say, ethical problems. Very good, yes. So we have this time of reflection, which, by the way, also overlaps with Greek philosophy. So we find this reflection in Greek thought, at least in 2 different avenues. One of them is the avenue of rational thinking, especially that of philosophy, and the other one is the one of narrative or mythical thinking. But nonetheless, we always find that reflection. And after that, we would find the age of decay, that is called Hellenism, and eventually Greek was going to be taken over by the Romans, although, as Horace puts it, Grecia capta ferum victorem cepit. Greece, being conquered the victor. Of course, military, Greece had nothing to do against the Roman invasion. But culturally, they had such a fascination to exert over the Romans that they literally conquered and gained the minds of the Romans. And if we know about the Greeks and about Greek culture and about Greek poetry, more often than not, that's going to come mediated through the Romans, right? And I've already explained something about Horace retaking the Sapphic stanzas and the archaic stanzas. Today I explain also the elegiac distich, because that's going to be Ovid's metrical pattern. And Virgil is going to use the dactylic hexameter, of course mimicking Homer in the Iliad, but also mimicking Theocritus, that is a Hellenistic poet in the Bucolics. Okay. A few final conclusive thoughts about Archilochus of Paros, that is also called the poet of hatred. So you can imagine what kind of feelings he was dealing with. And the poet of hatred and the Scorpion. So he has been surnamed the Scorpion. What can we say about Archilochus of Paros? I think I lost my sheet, but don't worry. Oh yes, here it is. He was born sometime around 680 BC, and he died in 640 BC. He was born to a notable family in Paros. He tells a legend where his father lost a cow. The cow went wandering into the fields, and he sent Archilochus, young Archilochus, to look for the cow. And he encountered the cow, but on his way back, guess what happened? He encountered the Muses, and the Muses asked him to exchange the cow for a lyre. So he got the lyre and gave the cow back to them, to the Muses. I don't know what his father thought after that, but well, that's the legend that he that he handed over to posterity. However, he believed to be endowed with this poetical gift, which is a gift that most of the times he used to abuse and insult other people. And to express his hatred. I think that the most remarkable instance is that of his fiancée, and then his fiancée's father took back the arrangement, and he said, no, she's not gonna marry you. So as a consequence of that, he wrote a poem that was so aggressive against Lycambes, that was the name of the father, and against Neobule, that was the name of his fiancée, that both of them committed suicide. And also Neobule's sister. Again, I don't know to what extent that is true or that's an account, especially because if you try to look at it as a metaphor, it makes a lot of sense. Neobule, a new will. So he is targeting and he's criticizing those who change their will, those who change what they have already stated. And by the way, he didn't regard this as something evil in itself. On the contrary, he regarded that as his moral duty, because he had to warn society against those people who change their minds, who breach their commitments, right? He also joins the Thasians in war, but he also expresses cynicism about the battle, and he flees. Nonetheless, in another battle, he dies. So he died in battle, and he dedicated one of his poems to his shield and to his spear, because that's what he made a living with. And well, I think I've given you a general overview of lyrical poetry, beginning with Sappho of Lesbos and finalizing with Archaic of Paris. You have their poems in the anthology. Of course, there are many more poems that you can read, but for next class, please read Antigone.